Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone to the start of AAM. My name is Angie Judge from Dexhibit and it's a pleasure to be with you here today, and we've got a fantastic panel to speak with us today. I can't find a better way to kick off AAM than to talk about AI, big data, analytics and predictive intelligence for museums and what that means for our future. Because around the world, museums are facing a cultural crunch. We're seeing business pressure approach us on every single side of our business model. For many of us, that will mean reduced government grants, for some changing tax laws which will affect donations and endowments, and for many increased competition for the visitor attention and for their spend in our shops and cafes. But luckily for us, with the rise of big data analytics, the growing ubiquity of the Internet of Things, and the benefits of cost savings and cloud and increased connectivity, AI is finally within the reach of our museums. And to prove it, today we're going to hear the stories of three museums: the National Gallery of London, the Broad in LA, and Arizona Science Centre from here in Phoenix, and how they are predicting the future with AI. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Heather Hart, who is the Director of IT, who leads a wide range of strategic initiatives and technology projects that have played a key role in transforming the Broad from a private foundation to a major public museum. And prior, Heather was the Director of IT at Balboa. Keith Laber, who is the Chief Information and Analytics Officer at Arizona Science Centre, has been delivering advanced analytics projects for the commercial sector and recently joined Arizona Science to implement data-driven solutions that are growing both their community impact and financial goals. And Chris Michaels, who is the Digital Director of London's National Gallery, is leading digital transformation in the cultural sector. Previously, Chris was the Head of Digital and Publishing at the British Museum, and he has worked in media, academia and startups. He is a very passionate advocate for analytics and data, for user research, for growth and for change. So you might have heard recently about how AI is creeping into our daily lives through things like Netflix or Uber. Our goal today is to demystify what AI means in today's world and how it can be democratized for museums large and small. AI incorporates lots of different branches of technology. We're seeing many angles on this in the museum. You might have heard about the Google Cultural Institute's new app, which will match your selfie with one of the famous artworks from galleries around the world. Or you might have seen the Barnes's work in machine vision, helping them decipher new meaning from their images. Or you might have seen the news recently about the Smithsonian's new bots called Pepper robots, which will be walking around the museum helping with visitor experience. So artificial intelligence incorporates lots of different types of technology that teach computers how to think, how to act, how to communicate, how to analyze, and how to interpret. And this is an entirely new era of technology potential for museums. Today, we are just going to scratch the surface with one of these branches called machine learning. Machine learning enables us to take our data, to feed it into a computer model, and to have that model listen to the ornate signals that tell us what's going on in our museums. It helps answer complex questions like why visitors might visit us or not, what helps drive their experience and spending, and ultimately what will convert them into the faithful members and keep them coming back. And one of the most powerful things that we can do with this technology is to forecast and predict what will happen tomorrow, next month, or next year. So I'm going to start today by asking our speakers to introduce themselves, to tell us a little bit about their museums, and to introduce their projects. We're going to dig into some great discussion topics covering their experiences in this area, and at the end we'll open up for audience Q&A. Keith, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Angie. My name is Keith Laba. I'm the Chief Information Analytics Officer at Arizona Science Center, so I'm the chow of Arizona Science Center. I am the local member of this panel, so I'd first like to welcome you to Phoenix and welcome you to your first heat advisory in early May. So that's, I apologize for that in advance. I've been with the center for about a year, a little over a year now, focusing on all things data, analytics, and really, the Arizona Science Center has been really good about capturing a lot of data. We've done a pretty robust CRM system. We have we've got manual tracking and automated tracking of a lot of data points. But one of the things that we found, our team has sort of found as part of our sort of integrating and marinating in the data is the need is really to get data out and turn that into insights and information and actionable recommendations. So that's where Angie and the exhibit team kind of came in as we started thinking about forecasting, because we have we've got lots of different expertise in the center. We've got our learning team who understands how school calendars affect visitation. We have our exhibits team who understands how our traveling exhibitions may affect visitation. We have our sales team who kind of understand what drives customers, what motivates them to come into the center. So we have lots of pieces of information, but what we don't really have is a holistic kind of kitchen sink approach to pulling all of those things in and being able to identify signals in the data and what's really driving it. It's not just about, it's seasonal, so yeah, the summer's going to be strong and great, and then we'll just assume it's all because it's summer season and schools are out. But it's also hot as heck in the summertime, so people need to get out of the heat. So those two things play together, and they play off each other. So our need is really around being able to identify and almost separate and pull apart the components, because those factors, those pieces that drive visitation, we can act on those, and those insights can help us identify strategies and tactics as an organization. So we're still very early on. We're still kind of in the sausage-making part of building a model. We're kind of in the data, knee-deep with Angie and her team, and understanding and identifying factors and trying to clean up the data, annotate the data, that kind of thing. So I'm not going to have a lot of, hey, we made $20 million on implementing a model, but we've got a lot of learnings already about what we get out of just the process of working with the data and building out the model. So we'll be talking about that to come. So
Thanks, Keith. Heather?
Hi, everybody. My name's Heather Hart. I'm the Director of IT at the Broad. There it is. For those of you who don't know, this is a relatively new contemporary art museum in LA. We recently welcomed our 2 millionth visitor. We've been open for about 2.5 years. So I've been there 5 years, so I was there, at the very beginning, kind of laying the foundation for how should one run a museum. What should your technology look like? What kind of data should we be collecting? And that was all, very exciting and fun. And so now we collect a lot of data. And, it's really great, but the sense is that there's so much in this data, and, I am just one person. And so when it comes to crunching that data, finding information from that data, you really need some help, and that's where like a business intelligence layer would come in. And so that's kind of where we are at this process is, needing to add this layer. The Broad has a relatively small footprint, this is it. But we have very high expectations when it comes to attendance. So it's not enough for us to be busy on weekends and, Labor Day, and kind of not so busy the rest of the time. So for us, we're really about maximizing attendance at the museum at all of the different days and times of the week and year. And so a big part of that is we do a very robust advanced reservation system where we are having people book free passes to come visit the museum. It's a free museum. And the whole idea there is to encourage people to come at 3 p.m. on Tuesday instead of Saturday morning at 9 a.m. And we do have a lot of success with that, but since these are free tickets, a lot of times we think it's valuable to give them out. People state their intention that they want to come. They give us their email address. They sign up for our newsletter. But a lot of times they don't come. So if we need to be maximizing attendance in all of these time slots, we need to understand who is going to come, who isn't going to come, and how many tickets we can release in each time slot. So we are riding at this kind of full capacity all the time so we can hit our attendance goals throughout the year. And so that's what this project is about. And then, we hope to kind of take that in many other directions in terms of what we can learn from our data.
Thanks, Heather. Chris?
Thank you, and good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm Chris Michaels, Digital Director at the National Gallery in London. National Gallery is one of the great British museums set up nearly 200 years ago to tell the story of European art, really masterpiece by masterpiece, one of the great collections of Western art that tells the story of the European tradition from about the 13th century through to the beginning of the 20th century. My story about data started when I walked into my first interview at the British Museum about 5 years ago. I came from the startup sector where in the apps I made, I knew basically every single thing that everybody did who used those apps. This really rich pool of individual user data that aggregated into something that made a huge amount of sense about the business I was trying to run. And I was really excited when I went to the British Museum because I looked around and thought, there must be so much data here. But then when I started working there, I found out actually there was a lot of data, but none of it made much sense in relation to all the other pools of data that existed there. And so in a way, my journey of trying to do digital in museums has been one where I've tried to bring data sets together to understand what they mean and to try and affect real economic change with them. Because that, for me, is why data matters in museums, is that particularly in the UK, but I think as much as I understand everywhere around the world, the economic model of museums is under intense pressure. The institution I work for has 30% less government funding than it did back in a decade ago, and that's a trend that's going to keep deteriorating. The pressures on consumer spend keep getting higher. Economic uncertainty around things like Brexit in the UK makes consumer confidence lower. So thinking it's going to get easier to make money is not true. And it's only going to get better in the way that we make money if we can use data to think through the things we do and adapt and evolve them accordingly. And so the real quest that I'm on, and we'll talk more about it through the presentation today, is really about understanding how our exhibitions make money. Because if you look at the economic model of British museums, and in a way that blockbuster exhibition model that goes through the biggest museums in the world, that sense of the economic power of exhibitions drives all of our economic model. And the trouble is, the forecasts we have of the number of people who come to them are incredibly wrong most of the time, to a margin of error of anywhere up to 90% either way. And some people think that doesn't matter, but I think it matters because I know the pain that happens every time you get it wrong. The endless reforecasting, the scrabbling around trying to make in-year budget cuts, the mess that it causes. And I think we get it wrong because we don't have enough information to make proper judgments with. And so we make human decisions that lead to wrong choices. And we make them over and over again. And we kind of get used to it so much that it becomes a big part of our working process. And simply for me, if I can give that over to the great AI gods in the sky and the cloud and say, well, kind of just make sense of this for me, then I think I can make the kind of working life of museums better. And so we're working on a big project with Angie at the moment to try and make the forecasting model for exhibitions better so that we can make more money and have less pain in the way that we operate as a gallery.
Thank you. So we've heard about 3 different case studies that we're going to talk about today. The first one being about predicting visitation, the second one being about predicting attrition, or people who will no-show on their tickets, and the third one to predict exhibition outcomes. And our panelists have talked a little bit about some of the challenges that they've faced and that have led them to this project. But the first question I wanted to ask is, what are some of the first things that started these projects for you? What were some of the inspirations that you came across that led you down this path, or the first activities that you took to get underway?
Shall I start?
If you like.
It's to carry on what I was saying, really. It was one, walking into a museum, thinking there must be lots of data, going hunting for it, realizing there were about 250 different data sources at play in the BM, and reckoning that none of them connected to any of the other ones. So all this stuff was kind of floating in space with no kind of overlapping sense of how it connected to each other. And the second was then understanding the business model and saying, well, actually, exhibitions do drive this, but we're wrong all the time. And so seeing the impact of that, where the financial implications of a big exhibition not working out the way you want can be anything up to, in a big UK institution, £10 million of overall value out in your financial year. That's a huge, huge problem that causes you. And it's a problem that might not just take 1 or 2 or 3 financial years to sweat out. It might make a difference over 5 to 10 years as your whole model kind of shifts accordingly. So to me, it's like a responsibility, therefore, to try and fix that problem. And again, that's for me where this data journey starts. It's like, this is a big problem that we've got to try and fix, and how do we go about fixing it?
For us, I think it was 2 things. One is that I think I'm revealing, some naivete about myself, but when I collected all this data, I went to report on it, and I'm using these reporting tools, and I think sometimes I expect technology to work the way I think that it should work and not the way that it actually works. And so, I'm doing my reports on attendance and attrition and how it's working. And, I really want to know, well, what does this mean about next week? What does this mean about next month? What does this mean about next year? What is the trend? And that's not like a feature. Like, that's not a thing, at least not in like a really good way. And it seems like a really important part of reporting. Like, sure, you can find out what happened last week or last month, but if you don't have the ability to kind of take that to the next level, I mean, I don't know what value there is in that. And so I started kind of manually doing this myself, like in Excel, which it takes a huge amount of time. And this is like 1/5, one like tiny 5% of what I do. So I don't have time for that. And then the other thing is that, over the course of time, if we miss our attendance by just 1%, 2%, 10 people per time slot, we do 30-minute time slots. That equals substantial attendance differences by the time you get to the end of the year. So we really need to be doing like as precise and accurate as possible, and not just like, well, I know that like usually on Saturday, based on my anecdotal human brain, I think probably this amount, which is, kind of what we've been doing in the past. So trying to be more precise and more efficient.
Ditto. But I think for me, being relatively new to this whole space, I kind of joined the team and was talking to lots of different people, and I talked about this already, but I would get the stories, and this is what really drives visitation. Well, and then another conversation. Well, it's really this, and this really has a lot of weight to it. So it really became obvious that there were a lot of components. And then as we start to, as Heather just said, as you start to try to build these models by hand, or you kind of just try to do a poor man's version of something like this, you start to peel away the onion, and you're like, okay, well, this is a pretty good model. It looks pretty good. And then you look at, well, your March sucks because, Arizona, they change their school calendars every year, and school break is all at different times in certain districts. So then all of a sudden you realize, oh, well, I didn't take that into account, and then you realize, oh, well, there's this other thing I didn't take into account, or oh, the weather was really crazy in this time period, so you didn't take that into account. So then you start to identify. You don't want to throw out the model, but what you really start to identify is that there's a need for tools and techniques that can really harness all of those things and start to see what things are correlated to each other, what's really driving it versus what's just kind of looks like it's driving it, but it's not really. So how do we get out of that anecdotal kind of world of I think and move into the I know world?
Thank you. Perhaps this next one for Chris. I know that predicting exhibitions wasn't the first thing that happened on this project, and in fact, to get there, it required quite a big shift of the way that we were working. What sort of groundwork do you think a museum needs to do before they get to the point where they're ready for machine learning?
I think the first bit in anything to do with data is work out what data you have. I said it was an exercise, did at the British Museum, did at the National Gallery. Just go around and count, because you will be amazed how rich and complex the sources of data in a museum are. Because you're running a physical building, an IT infrastructure, a consumer marketing business, a retail business, you're generating tons of different stuff. And the notion that a museum is just this kind of static building that's not generating, which is absolutely wrong. Your lighting systems are generating data. Your conservation, humidity measures are generating data. Your CCTV cameras are generating data. And until you understand the complexity of those sources and kind of cluster them together in a group and say, well, what are these things and what can they mean to each other, you won't have a sense of the potential that you can do with things, because increasingly what AI and big data is doing is it's making the jump between systems and between data sets smaller. So you can do incredibly sophisticated things with CCTV now, which historically in a museum is a security issue, into counting and forecasting visitation, into modeling threat prevention for terrorism. All of these things start to kind of link together in interesting new ways. But if you don't know what they are, they'll remain in silos. So get the map, build the map of the data sources, and start to think about the things that you could learn by comparing them together. Once you do that, start focusing in on the practical first steps you can work from. For me, that was working from the kind of consumer marketing data sets, social media, website, ticket sales, e-commerce, and start to build a picture of how those things particularly connect together. Because they're the kind of sweet spots that you can start to kind of push at straight away. It's harder to work out, can I save lots of electricity by working the gap between the conservation and the Wi-Fi data? That's a kind of, it's like a natural state, step 2 phase. But work on those consumer data sets and start to think of some things that you want to change. But also, then just that third part is identify the business problems in the organization. Because the worst thing that anyone could do with data is just keep it as an abstract academic exercise, and I think that's a very dangerous place to be, which could be in the temptation of some museums, which think in kind of academic ways. Find the business problems that you want to solve. And to me, that was right across the piece. Ticket sales, membership sales, how do we get more donations? All of these questions that I could see were problems to the organization. I could just say, well, look, okay, what can I learn enough about from a data model to think about the answer in a different way? So finding the problems on one side, understanding the data on the other side, and then just thinking how you can kind of correlate those two together to start producing change.
And how about for you, Keith? What sort of fundamentals did you find you needed to put in place in Arizona? You talked a bit about how you needed to annotate different events and turn those into factors.
Yeah, so I think what Chris says is exactly right. It's figuring out your data landscape. But then I think one of the things that we say a lot is, data is a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient, in that you have to have data, but you can't just have data and then do stuff. Like you need to get in the data. You need to get knee deep in it. You need to marinate in it. And you need to play around in it and figure out what it is. What weird things are happening in this data? What is it telling us? And then where we've been working a lot with Angie's team as an example, just annotating and identifying, well, here's some historical visitation data, but let's not just treat it in a vacuum. It's like, well, we have our crazy high visitation for our free weekend days, and those cause crazy outliers, and if you just threw that into a model, the model would throw up. It would have no idea what to do. So it's doing that 80%. The 80-20 rule in analytics is you're going to spend 80% of your time just munging around in the data and kind of the not so sexy stuff. Well, other people might think it's not sexy, but it is. But this idea that you just want to play around, because that's actually where you get a lot of your aha moments and the insights that are sort of byproducts, which we'll talk about later, of the model, of model development. But you have to get comfortable in that 80%. You got to spend some time in there and just play around in the data and just try things and look at it, graph it, visualize it, play with it in different ways, put it together. Like Chris said, put some data elements together. Do they move together? Are there any weird relationships there? So that's kind of where we are, and that's a lot of fun. Take my word for it. But and then you get to the point where you can start running models and evaluating and that kind of thing. So I think that's where playing in that data, doing the annotation of school calendars and well, this is when school holidays were, and these are the types of events that occurred in downtown Phoenix over this period of time, or we had our own events at Arizona Science Center during these periods, so that drove increased visitation, or this is when we had traveling exhibitions running, that kind of thing. So that's been really helpful in us just understanding, starting to narrow down what some of those factors are and what really are driving visitation.
Thank you. And Heather, as you've got into this area of technology, have you found other financial benefits in terms of revenue or cost savings?
Yeah, so we have, I don't know if I mentioned this, we are sold out mostly, so it's a unique position at the Broad, but we won't always be sold out, and there's, a lot of what we're doing in this area and thinking about is other ways that we can use this data. We may not have a ROI in terms of, revenue from ticket sales, but there is if we can tell that, our staff, that our attendance is going to be going down, and therefore, maybe we don't need to staff as aggressively as we have been. There's real potential for savings there, or, maybe there's other increased efficiencies we can find based on how many people are going to be in the building, how much excitement is going to be in the building. Maybe we don't need to scale up our web server for our ticket release. There's all of these little things. And then also, museums are unique. We're retail stores, and we're public, and we're event venues, and we're all of these things, but we all have those things in common for the most part. So, now, I have contributed this data about how do people behave with free advance reservations. And so if anyone else wants to experiment with, free passes, and they don't want to have to learn those hard lessons themselves in terms of, how do people behave with that, then, we've done some of that work. And, I think there's real power here in sharing that and, contributing all of our crazy different scenarios together and using them to draw insights from each other.
Thank you. And I'm sure one of the questions that everybody here is probably thinking to themselves is, where on earth do you find the talent to do this sort of thing, and how do you develop this kind of skill set for such a new area of technology? Maybe you could start us off, Chris.
It was an interesting thing when I started doing this that there weren't people in the sector doing analytics and data science. So basically, as far as I know, when we hired a data scientist at the BM, it was just about the first time anyone had done it in the UK. And it's a kind of risky moment because you're bringing a different work culture into an environment where it's not been before. But actually, in a place like the BM, which is full of scientists in different contexts, having a new type of scientist actually was a kind of very natural cultural fit, because the people looking after the objects from a scientific point of view are all mangling wild kind of data sets all the time. So it was kind of fine. But I think the thing we have to be practical and recognize is that sometimes to do this kind of stuff, you're going to need to bring new types of people and new skill sets in. Thinking you can just send someone on a 2-day training course and they're going to come back able to do R and with the right kind of mathematical capability is not true. The degree backgrounds that people might have to do this might be physics, might be pure maths, might be statistics. Art galleries are not full of those people in their natural kind of workforce base. So there are going to be some interesting decisions about staffing and recruiting that come through that process. Now, you want to build up the skill sets of your internal teams, but there are going to be threshold points where simply computational capability is not going to be high enough. So you've got to, think how to cross that line and to resource effectively. And those are staffing decisions across the kind of digital technology transformation piece that we're going to keep on having to make in the years ahead. Not just data science, but all those areas. We're going to have to go looking for new talent. But the good news is every job in every industry is being transformed in the same way. People like Keith who've come from a commercial analytics background can now come into the sector because there's jobs of meaning to do. And there are certainly the skills base being built in wider job sectors that can now come into the museums industry. So it's important, but it's going to be, as I said, different types of decisions about who we recruit we'll have to make in the years ahead.
So there's no way we will ever hire a data scientist, speaking from the smaller museum side of things. And, I wish, that we could, But I think, many museums may make the choice that, there's a lot of different competing needs. And I think that's where, it doesn't mean that you can't do, any kind of predictive analysis or that you can't leverage these tools. I think you may have to lean a little bit harder on a vendor, or, you have to kind of build up those skills throughout your staff. So, get these insights to people throughout the organization so that it's not just, siloed in this one department. How can these insights, inform their work and get them interested in how it affects them, and then I think you can build up those skills. But for us, I think it is a real challenge that there's not really like a role carved out for this yet in the organization.
And I guess, yeah, we're somewhat unique. We actually built an analytics team, so, but I think one of the things that kind of to go along with what Chris and Heather are saying is we're actually, one of our approaches is we actually aren't even looking at hiring, full-blown credentialed data scientists. We're just looking for obnoxiously curious people. I mean, these are the people who do the crossword puzzle. They're always asking why things are occurring. And they exist in your organization somewhere. I mean, one of our directors of analytics, he's an accountant by trade, and he doesn't have an applied mathematics background, but he has been with the organization for a while, and he just asks questions, and he's just curious, and to the point where I'm like, chill out. But I mean, it's getting that list of just questions and trying to get under the cover of something, and then we figure out how to solve the problem. I mean, to Chris's point, you have to be nimble, and then say you work with like a Digxibit to help with maybe some of the advanced mathematics, but we try to maintain this level of altitude of big picture thinking and helping strategically how what problems we want to tackle. So I think that's one of the things. There's this soft skill of just wanting to figure problems out and then being MacGyver-y and figuring out how to do that. So.
Chris, I remember you mentioned to me a couple of months back that there was this interesting aha moment for you in terms of looking at how forecasting changed the way you thought about the future in the museum in terms of the older way of doing things, of coming up with a number versus the new way of doing things. Could you talk a bit about that?
Well, it might be more like an moment than an aha moment, but I mean, this is in the context of doing annual financial forecasts, which, take up far too much of everybody in museums' time. And we're in the process of doing a 5-year financial plan, which is like the worst nightmare humanly imaginable, particularly as our second 5-year plan in 2 years. So, it's a kind of complicated moment. But the moment for me was, sitting with our finance director and our director of retail, and the three of us being given the task to decide what the number is. How many people are going to come. And, we're all good, smart, sensible people, hopefully, but, is it 5.2 or is it 5.4 million next year? And it's like, okay, well, let's go 5.4. And it's such an arbitrary gesture for something that actually drives so much of what an organization does. And, it's a classic senior manager thing, is you empower the senior manager people to make those decisions. But that 5.4 is going to carry through this year, next year, the year after. We're kind of making that assumption for like a 5-year period, and it can't be true. The only thing you can say is that cannot be a true decision, but yet we're carrying it through our financial model. So you have to think to a future where forecasting is accurate and therefore is changing all the time. As we've started to do predictive forecasting with Angie and Digxibit, I can see, because I can rerun the forecast every day, how the forecast changes every day according to what it's learning as it goes through. We've been through a very heavy period of fluctuation in our visitor figures at the moment. We lost 1 million people last year on the year before. So, and as that started to rebuild in our numbers this year, when we first ran a predictive forecast in December, it said that we would have gone from 5.2 million people last year to 4.3 million people next year, which is like a disaster. Now, as we've seen some fluctuations according to things, some crazy weather in London, some particular circumstances, it's back up at 5.6. So in the space of trying to learn through predictive forecasting, A, you can see how uncertain the future remains, but B, you can see how you need to keep changing your forecast as you go through it. And so building a business process that's much more supple, that isn't just, okay, let's take a once-a-year discussion between some senior management people to make a decision, but let's keep on remaking the decision every month, every week, every day if we have to, becomes a very critical thing for us in the years ahead, and gives us the suppleness to then change the overall balance of our financial model according to what we learn as we go along.
So as this number is changing, the other question that starts to arise is how accurate it is in terms of what's coming up immediately. What sort of accuracy for you constitutes good accuracy, and what do you do if it's not accurate?
Well, as I said, we started from a pretty bad place where a margin of error for exhibitions could be, 80% out. We had an exhibition, a Michelangelo exhibition last year that the museum was convinced was going to be a blockbuster at a kind of 200,000 person level, and it ended up at the 100,000 person level. That's a multi-million pound gap that it creates in the finances. And you could see the case why either of those two outcomes was possible. So for me, being better than that is like a starting point. But, reasonable margin of error, 10% to 15% seems like a reasonable place to be when, we've got kind of Arizona weather in London at the moment, which we don't get very often. And so visitation plummets. We had crazy snow 2 months ago. Visitation goes up by 40% in a day, So there's factors you're never going to be able to kind of totally deal with. But getting to a reasonable margin of error seems like, 10, 15% range seems like a good place to be to me.
I think it's very similar. What we're doing right now is kind of benchmarking our human predictions and then, comparing how the model, compares to that. And I think, the goal is to be, as good as the human to start, and then, build on that and keep rerunning it and keep making it better. And I think right now, a lot of times we don't know how accurate we are. We don't use a lot of times hard terms. We'll say things like, we expect attendance to be strong, or, we think it will be weak, or, we kind of use these subjective terms, and then when we get to the end, we can say oh, yes, we were right, it was very strong. But it's not actually quantified in any particular way. So, there's, I think a lot of times, nothing to say that the model isn't, more accurate or not, if you're not kind of tracking the behavior of, your human predictions.
And we're still pretty early on, so we're using it more as accuracy as a calibration tool for the visitation model. But I think one of the things that, and this is from previous lives, but also that I'm very focused on, is that the minute you start measuring error, it now it puts it as a target for people to complain about. So if you have, even if you're at 85%, 90%, and someone's like, well, what about the 10%? I want that 10%, but again that could cost you twice as much just to get that last 10% or whatever. So, focusing on putting context around that. We had in a previous role, we had built a predictive model to predict the actions of a customer, whether customers would take a particular action, and it was a real-time model that we predicted, and we were at about 63%, and one of the leaders was like, that kind of stinks. And I'm like, well, the fact that only 3% of people actually take the action, so if you just randomly chose, you'd have a 3% accuracy. So we're at 63%. So let's provide a little bit of context around that to help people understand kind of where we're going. So I love kind of Heather's point of benchmarking against people, because that's what we've been doing to this point. We've been just sort of saying, attendance is going to be 500,000 next year. Okay, let's put that on the board as a guess, and let's put someone else as a board. Let's do some crowdsourcing of guesses, and then let's put it up against the model, and it gives you context around that. So I think that helps to really give some weight to what the model is doing.
Thank you. One of my favorite parts of forecasting is that you get to compare what happens in real life versus what you thought was going to happen. And when you compare the two together, you get the residual, or the difference between that. And sometimes that might be a positive residual, as in we got more visitors than we thought we were going to get. Or sometimes it might be a negative residual in terms of we didn't get as many people as we thought we should have got. And that can help us analyze good things that we might want to double down on in terms of, say, for example, our marketing, or bad things that we might want to mitigate against. Do we want to hear a couple of thoughts on how these sorts of things can start to drive different behaviours and how we lead and manage it in the museum?
Well, I mean, I think probably all of us are just at the beginning of this process, right? So we're at a point where we're just running a predictive forecast for an exhibition fully for the first time. So we've got a Monet exhibition on, it's a very big deal for us. First Monet exhibition in London for 20 years. So it's like a big thing. And the forecast for it was, again, a human-made forecast. And you could make a reasonable assumption that somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000 people would turn up. And that's, again, a very wide range, right? Anywhere between those 2 points is a kind of sensible outcome. Now, because we got burnt on Michelangelo last year, we were being good, sober, professional people and saying, well, let's go at the lower range of expectation. So we forecast 150,000. Now, what the model is telling us is that we're completely wrong. And the model is saying 220,000 at the moment. And it's tracking at, as it's going through, it's tracking and forecasting at 91% accuracy week on week. We're only at week 3 of the exhibition. So hopefully, the byproduct is a positive change, which is that the model is better than we are, and we make more money than we thought we're going to make. Now, again, in the weirdness of museums, making more money than you're supposed to make can be just as problematic as making less money than you're supposed to make, because all the reforecasting process still has to happen. But hopefully, we come out better from it, and it gives credibility to the process. Because ultimately, again, there's a kind of human thing. Until the machine is better than the human being, you're never going to quite trust it. And that's, I think, ultimately what you all have to build as you try and build analytics capability, is credibility that the things that for 200 years, in our case, that human beings have been making judgments on, often with adjectives rather than numbers, are the right things to do. And so, again, this is a good outcome for us if it gets it right. And that's what, because then we can make the cultural, behavioural changes that really come from it. But it needs to keep on being right, and it needs to be right for 2, 3, 5 exhibitions in a row to A, that we learn enough, and B, that we kind of properly can make the twist that comes from kind of relying on that kind of machine-led thinking in how the organisation operates.
Keith, maybe you could talk a little bit more on the byproducts around the way the model is telling us what is of relative importance and how that can be used.
Yeah, I think kind of going back to some of the conversation earlier, we've got a lot of things happening at the same time. And it's, our business is changing, we're changing the way we market, we're changing who we're talking to, what's happening in the environment is changing. The idea about science and facts and that attitude is changing. Things are always changing, and they're happening at the same time. So one of the things that models can help us do is try to pull those apart and try to really zero in on what are some of the bigger factors. Like, okay, seasonality is big. Okay, we understand that, but is it the only thing, or is it, well, actually weather plays a part in there, and events play a part in there, and traveling exhibitions play a part in there. But it starts to give you, if you picture a Pareto curve of here, this is big, and this is a little bit less big, and then this is a little bit, and it's going down. It starts to pull that apart. So then those are actionable things. I think Angie already said you can then go attack that and say, this really drives visitation. Some may be things that we control, some may be things that we don't control, but we can control how we respond to that and how we take advantage of that, or to the good or to the bad. So I think that's been a good finding so far as it relates to kind of building out the model, is starting to pull those pieces apart, and rather thinking of them as a big mushy whole bunch of stuff in one big pile driving visitation. There's actually pieces that are working independent of each other and then kind of coming together to create what that end visitation number is.
And Heather, we had a similar experience at the Broad, right? As the machine learning model was being built and tested, and we were looking at some of the byproducts in terms of why it was predicting things that it was and what factors were important. And one of the interesting things from my perspective is we got to see that play out in a couple of museums, because at the same time we were testing it across at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC, who also use advanced pass ticketing. So here we have on both sides of the country 2 very different museums, one history and one art, dealing with advanced passes, and very different reactions to some of those factors. Doesn't snow much in LA, but it sure causes problems in DC when it does. So are you able to talk a little bit about what sorts of things came up during this process that were interesting for you?
Yeah, so I think the things that, in LA we did not see weather being a big, factor. But, there's lots of other factors that kind of affect the model, and I think that a caveat for any discussion about these types of analytics or predictive forecasting is that just because you have a forecast and a model doesn't mean you can't, try to change that or try to impact that model by changing the way that you do things or the way that you price a ticket or the way you market an exhibition. You use that as a tool and one of many, but it doesn't mean that you kind of then rest on your laurels like, oh, we're going to get 220,000 people, we don't have to do anything else. I think that's a really important message for like any executive kind of leadership. So we sort of use this as a baseline for understanding, okay, well, if people have advanced really far in advance, or if the reservation is free, those are things that make it less likely for them to come, which, as a consumer makes sense. If I say, that I'm going to go to something for free in 5 months, probably I'm not going to do that. Whereas if I say today, I intend to do this thing for free tomorrow, the chances that I'm going to do it are much more likely. The volume of marketing that we're doing, where we're marketing, these are all things that kind of play into that and affect that model. And it's constantly evolving and changing as our exhibitions change and school calendars change and all of this stuff. So I'd say it's a process of continual improvement.
So I want to switch it up a bit right now, and I know AI is a fairly future-facing technology to begin with, but now that we're at this point where we've been able to analyse and predict these situations, when it comes to looking back at what changes that might affect in the museum itself, Chris, could you talk a bit about your vision for how you see ticketing pricing changing in the future based on some of the things that we've learned from forecasting?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's part of a wider thread of work I'm doing around kind of modernisation of business models. So, everything I looked at that museums did as business models, if you trace them back, they all started at a point in time, and that point in time is typically a long time ago. So, the way we sell exhibition tickets in the UK is like a timed slot model that basically comes from the Met when they had Tutankhamun in the 70s. And that's a long time ago. And it was a brilliant idea at the time in the 1970s. But if I look at how you price and manage demand for things in a digital economy, it's not the same. Amazon, low-cost airlines, whatever it is, a dynamic shifting price is the logic of contemporary pricing. And to me, we just got to take those examples of how museums have been doing things for a long time and shift it to what a digital economy model would look like. And that's not a straightforward process, but by learning about our audience through data and analytics, we can make the kind of real-time business decisions that mean we can move to new models. And that means, dynamically priced tickets that change whether you're buying online or in person at the gallery, that change whether you're buying 6 months in advance or 10 minutes in advance, and change according to 20 factors rather than one factor. And it might mean, monthly subscriptions for memberships on a kind of Netflix style rather than the kind of annualized subscription, which is something that goes back right to the beginning of the 19th century as a way of kind of people transacting with museums. We just got to keep going through this so that we can make museums relevant to a very different economic age, and an economic age that is driven by the internet. And so it's that process of change that we will never get to unless we understand and react to our data better and build that capability and capacity through the organization to respond to things. Because, you know, museums don't change things often enough. And if we make a change now, I hope it isn't a pricing model that lasts for another 50 years. But what you want is it can be a model that adapts as it goes, rather than staying the same for decades at a time. And that, like I said, that's a big process for me of right across the organisation trying to make those changes work.
And Heather, I know when I book a ticket on an airline or a hotel room, my ticket price changes a little bit depending on all sorts of things, which is similar to what Chris is talking about. But I also know that sometimes those airlines and hotels put out overage to allow for capacity and to maximise their opportunity. Is that a way you see the Broad advancing in terms of becoming more dynamic of reacting immediately to attrition forecasting?
Yeah, so the ultimate goal is for, you know, our capacity on any particular day, the number of tickets that are released or reserved total, to completely dynamic based on, you know, maybe some things that are informed by a model like this, as well as our, you know, our staffing levels. You know, these things are all things that would impact how many people we can accommodate in the museum in a day. And so, you know, the ultimate goal is to, you know, always be at that 100%. So we are routinely selling, you know, even for paid exhibition, you know, 10, 20, even sometimes even 30% more tickets than we can actually like accommodate in the museum. And for free passes, it can be twice as many because, you know, again, if they're free, people are a lot less likely to come. And so for a paid program or exhibition, there's, you know, a whole amazing revenue stream of people who never actually come, you know, which is great. But we still want people in the museum, you know, in their space. And so right now we do this in a admittedly pretty manual way where we're adjusting, you know, we're able to release more advanced reservations in times like the afternoons, evenings, than on a Saturday morning. And we'll, you know, be adjusting and changing that kind of on a weekly basis.
And Keith, I have one last question, perhaps for the whole panel, but you could start us off. Is for museums out there who are thinking about going down this pathway, what would be the one last tip that you would leave with them?
I think it would be, this is something I say obnoxiously all the time, all models are wrong, some models are useful. I think mathematician George Bach said that. I use it all the time because there's going to be an iterative process to this, and I think the goal would be to start now because of the byproducts of going through model development. You're not going behind a door, closing it, and then 3 months later coming out and saying, I have a model, we're all ready to go. It's a process that incorporates the entire business. It makes the business think logically and structured about their part of the world. So you start to get insights and aha moments all along the way. So I would, and the idea that you don't need to be, you know, a PhD mathematician to be able to wrap all this together. You just need to be resourceful, and then work with people who can help you get there. I would say starting, it shouldn't feel like a daunting task. It should feel like something where you just need to dedicate some portion of your brain cells to focusing on that and getting it off the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we did, you know, attendance is, you know, kind of our primary goal. So for us, you know, this process has started with something that's attendance driven, but I think, you know, that would vary depending on your organization's kind of primary mission and goals. But then just, you know, finding something you can quantify, something small, something that you can kind of just chunk out. You know, we have a lot of things that we want to be modeling and, you know, predicting and, you know, using this data to kind of drive a lot of our decisions. And so just starting with one part of that and seeing how it goes, I think it doesn't have to be a daunting, huge, multi-year process. I think if you could start seeing kind of quick wins from it, you know, it's a much more fun process.
I mean, I think really I'd just say that this is an area where museums aren't special. You know, museums have a tendency to think of themselves in this kind of brilliant bubble where they're kind of different from the rest of the world. Here, they're not different from the rest of the world. Every business, every organization, wherever you are, is going through a process of change based on data. And so this is a unique opportunity actually to connect to the business over the road from you, the not-for-profit, the education organization, who are all going through that thinking process of change, and listen and learn with them as we go. You know, I had an amazing conversation with one of our corporate sponsors, a big Swiss private bank, and their problems are so similar to our problems. And we've never had that similarity before. And so this is a great opportunity to learn with everyone else as this kind of substantive change in the way kind of business and society goes through. So museums just aren't special here, but we can learn in a collaborative way with others how to make some of these changes.
Great. Well, thank you very much for sharing your experiences with us. I wanted to leave lots of time for audience Q&A, and we do have a spare microphone, which is this one up here, if anybody would like it. But if I can invite anybody who would like to ask a question at this stage, feel free to yell out or feel free to come up if you'd like a microphone.
I'll try and yell.
I can hear you just fine.
Thank you so much. This has been fascinating, and you've talked at length about data and analytics informing the business model. But I'm wondering if you could talk about your experience or knowledge of how data analytics is informing other aspects, for example, the content and program model, not just how many programs and exhibitions and where they're placed on a calendar, but also the nature of the exhibitions themselves and how analytics might be used to address audience appeal even before they're built or put on the calendar.
I think if I might jump in with something here, Chris and I were talking about this yesterday. Along with the National Gallery, we've also been doing exhibition simulation with a couple of other museums. And in many cases, this is happening a long time before the exhibition even opens, you know, a year out in terms of the planning that goes behind these exhibitions. And as we begin to forecast, say that the museum comes and says, I want a ticket price of $15 on this special exhibition, and we can come back and say, actually, you know, if you made it $20, you might get a few more visitors and make a lot more money. Or the museum comes and says, I think this exhibition is going to be a blockbuster. And we can go back and say, here's what it will look like if it is, but if it's not, it will look like this. Or we had a museum come and talk about, we've got an exhibition and we're not sure if we should make it an art-styled exhibition or a science or history-styled exhibition. Can you show us what this model will look like either way? And all of those sorts of things, whether they be resonance factors coming out of marketing evaluation feedback or focus groups, whether they be key decisions about what date an exhibition might start or how long it can go for, all of these sorts of things go in and influence the model and the behavior curves and the numbers that come out of it. And so we start to see the way in which machine learning can help make those decisions. Not to say necessarily that we should only do big blockbusters that are going to bring in the numbers and make the financial goals, but to be able to inform these decisions, because ultimately they become part of the mission, the wider mission framework of the museum, so that we can say, if we made this decision, it would look like this, and if we made this decision, it will look like this. And I think by being able to use data to inform those things, we take the pressure off perhaps what has in the past been a curatorial responsibility, to be able to take a good guess of something and sort of de-ego some of those key decisions and predictions that are happening in the museum. Is that a similar experience to what you found?
Yeah, I mean, you know, clearly when you're a data person, you start telling curators, you know, to how to adapt some of their subject matter. You tread on holy ground and you tread on it carefully, right? It's a very quick trip to the unemployment line that can possibly await for some of those things. But the thing that you can do is stiffen some of the processes. So, you know, increasingly museum exhibitions are very receptive to kind of qualitative research, so formative and summative method about kind of trying to understand in advance. The thing for someone like me who wants to go looking for volume and quality of data is say, well, like, how do we build a bigger data set around that? Because often those formative and summative pieces can be like talking to 50 people or 100 people. And it's very hard, while the insights from people are brilliant and useful, it's very hard to find statistically valid conclusions from those things. And so to me, it's kind of like, well, okay, how do we take those qualitative methods and expand them to a much larger group of people? So it's not just the kiosk that you fill in the survey at the end of it, but every person who comes gets surveys over email. How do I keep expanding the volume of and reach of people to whom I can contact to build as big a data set as possible about what people really think about this? And if you take that attitudinally and kind of work through that process, you can find a nice meeting point between qualitative and quantitative, because you want that human insight. It's incredibly important to the process, but you want as much of it as possible to make sure that the opinion is really meaningful. So there's a stiffening. Again, having worked at the British Museum and the National Gallery, you don't mess with the curatorial vision of what those things are, who the artists are and what the subject matter are. And we've got to be sensitive to that, or we risk losing the soul of what makes museums and galleries what they are. But we can, as I said, we can stiffen a lot under the hood to make things better.
And I would just add one other piece to this, is that where we've really been focusing on is really understanding the content appeal from a segmentation perspective, and really understanding our customers at a much more granular level, and trying, so it's enhanced some of the research that we do, some of the title testing where we're asking maybe a few more anonymized but like age questions and how long have you been engaged with the center and questions, so that we can really understand appeal, so we're better. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but we're not treating our customers as a monolith. So, and content is a really big piece of that, because we understand that content appeals to different segments. So how you deploy that is something that we can harness and really see and optimize revenue that way.
Oh, lots of questions. I'm going to start at the front here.
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting panel. I very much appreciate your comments. But I do want to try to put this in context of how the private sector works. I used to work for an electric utility, California, and I was in charge of the 20-year forecast. And there's many traditional forecasting tools that we used. Then we had deregulation, and then instead of forecasting 20 years in the future, we had to predict the day ahead. And that was much more difficult to do than 20 years in the future. But the point of it is that in terms of the value and of the forecast, in terms of the reduction of variance and the precision, we could measure that in terms of what it would mean in terms of how much loss utility would incur if it was off by such and such a percentage. And so to justify that we actually needed more resources to do the day ahead than we were doing for the 20-year was somewhat of an uphill struggle, but at the end of the day, we presented a quantitative case of what that value would be. My question to you is, do you see a point in the museum, in the nonprofit world, where the management and the board will start to pay more attention to the cost of adding incremental capability, considering all the other demands for capital, for acquisitions, for infrastructure and operations? Thank you.
I think they will. I mean, I think what I'm doing right now is I'm putting together, all of this information on how much money we spend gathering and, storing data. And it's, a significant investment for most institutions. I mean, it's a lot of data, it's a lot of storage, it's coming from a lot of sources. And if we're not analyzing it, it's basically a wasted investment. And so that's currently the track that I am pursuing. But I do think that I think it takes a little bit longer in the museum world for that, the things that are happening, in the kind of for-profit sector to trickle in, but I think that it will. And it'll start with the larger organizations and it will work its way down.
I think it's a mindset piece. I mean, one, doing this kind of stuff is not crazy money. Museums spend a lot more and get a lot less back in many other things that they do. So, and Angie will give you a great deal if you want to go with the exhibit. But I think it's much as a mindset thing. If you're working in a utility company, what you're trying to do is create, or any business, you're trying to create more economic value so you can create growth. And the side effect of that is you can create more jobs. The not-for-profit sector, particularly museums, tends to think the other way around, is that by being very imprecise in the way they think about the economics of what they do, they mean that they can never commit to growth and more jobs. It's always deductive. So you get your forecast wrong in an exhibition. The one thing you guarantee is that unfilled jobs stay unfilled and that requests for new jobs in the financial year that follows get turned down. And so you have this kind of heavy scarcity model that people are always living with day on day, which is very, it's very reductive, and it stops people wanting to work in the sector. So for me, this is invest to create more money so that you can invest better in the people you've got, hopefully, pay rises, like normal professional things that people should get, and more jobs in more capabilities that come alongside it. And so it's a business-minded point of view to create growth that helps the organisation and helps the people who work for the organisation. I think a small investment in analytics capability is worth doing that to get to the benefits that the private sector businesses have had for, again, hundreds of years.
Another question there.
All of you mentioned at the very beginning that you were working with Angie on a project, and I'm wondering, you all have somewhat similar titles, but somewhat different. But we find, when we look at museums of all sizes, that even having an information technology officer, someone who handles all of the technology in the museum, the social media, the incoming and outgoing information, is really challenging. So I'm wondering, do you wear different hats? Is this the only thing that you're doing, or are you also handling the digital technology within your museum?
Heather, do you want to take that one?
Yes, so I handle anything and everything vaguely tech-related at our museum, except we do have a social media manager, so I don't do that, but I develop the website, I manage our CRM system, I get whatever reports, so, it is within the realm of possibility for a smaller institution, I think, if that answers your question.
It's actually any size.
Yeah. For anyone who wears multiple hats, I think that wearing multiple hats gives me kind of a unique insight into a lot of different areas. So, I kind of understand where the data is coming from and, from visitor services and from retail and how the executive team is using it. And so I like to think that it, kind of gives me a perspective, or that's what I tell myself anyway.
I think I have a similar experience where I get to talk to lots of museums of all different shapes and sizes. And I've seen museums with very large data teams. Some of those museums have been quite small. I know one of them does about 250,000 visitors a year and has 3 data scientists on staff, which is incredible. And others that are very, very large that do millions of visitors a year and do not have a single data staff member who is solely dedicated to that job, and it's just part of everyone's role. And I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong way of doing things, just sort of a decentralized versus centralized mechanism of approaching this. I think for museums that don't have any data staff on board at the moment, and even if it's not going to be the case in future, the best place to start is by forming a bit of a committee of people who are interested in a topic, maybe some early adopters from marketing, from finance, from visitor services, etc., and just getting a good cross-section of people from across the organisation to start talking about this topic. Yes?
So my question's about human factors. In my experience in museums, I've seen different news isn't liked and isn't inwardly digested by often museum directors or senior management. So I was wondering if each of you, or when you work with your clients, if you make sure there's buy-in from the top, because if you do all this work and then you say, No, director of the National Gallery, you were completely wrong on that one, which he was. And that's a big political, curatorial mess. So I think that this is incredibly powerful, but also needs gentleness or buy-in from the top, or it's just going to be a waste of time. And your thoughts on that?
It's sensitive, right? It is sensitive. I had to tell off a senior member of our team the other day because I realized they were weaponizing data to try and make a good news story where there was only a bad news story. So somebody had said in a report, like, it's brilliant. This exhibition is brilliant because 25% of the people who came were under 25. And I was like, that's not true. It's true, but it's not true, because it just meant actually no one else came to the exhibition, as opposed to, you know, and so it's a hard thing because when you again, it's like curatorial things about passion and love and knowledge, right? And then you're coming along saying, sorry guys, you're wrong. And we've got to have that grown-up conversation, because it's okay to be, like, people are wrong all the time. Like, we're wrong about everything all the time. So it's okay to be wrong, but we've got to try and just commit to making better decisions in the first place. And I think that means, in a practical way, have that conversation one-to-one behind closed doors first, rather than a room full of people who say, sorry guys, you're wrong. Yes, it doesn't play very well. But we've got to get more grown up about that. And that's, again, not a unique museum challenge. Most businesses have been run for most of the last couple hundred years by people who were the person at the top who said, I know what's right. And the trouble is, most of the time they weren't right. And so it's a process of accommodation and change to say, well, this data, this information is the truth, and let's align around that truth. But it's a hard thing to do.
And I would add, just from the approach that we take from an analytics perspective and leading analytics teams, is I would say it's over 50% of success of analytics is cultural. It's being able to understand the business, being able to work with people and partner with them effectively with common goals, and then be able to position the data in a way that's easily digestible but true, and really true, and tells a story. I mean, my boss tells me all the time, data don't lie, but people do. So you have to be careful. But I would say that the most successful people I've worked with from a data analytics perspective are people who can work with people. And that's not always the easiest thing in the world. I mean, I know. But working on that skill set is so important for people to be successful in organizations. And that's what gets you the buy-in. That's what gets people to start believing it, so that it doesn't become something it just becomes part of your culture, part of the way that you operate as an organization.
I think, for us, we're very, we're always looking at numbers in terms of what has happened, how many people came last year, but, it's kind of, you have to be brave to put out a number about what's going to happen next month, because then, if you don't hit it, you can't really shirk from that in the way that you could if you were like, well, there's going to be a lot of people. And so I think that is, a challenge, and one that I think we've just been through a little bit. But I think that when you actually, can do it, and you put a number on it, and you say, this is what we're working towards, and kind of everyone is on board with that, then you kind of get, first of all, everyone is on the same page, everyone's working towards the same goal, and I think, if you're going to be kind of an effective institution, it's something you have to be prepared to do. So hopefully we can all get there.
And there's great benefit, isn't there, in sort of unlocking the access to that data in the first place, and then putting it in the hands of lots of people, is that you do kind of bring them together on that common goal in the process.
Yeah, I think a lot of, we kind of understand that we're collecting this data, but, as I talk to my colleagues, that actually, I find out that they don't really, understand that this is part of it, or, what patterns we can identify that have impact on, what they do for us. So, for our marketing and communications person, how this can impact, how they're doing their job, and whether they're being effective, and They thought that we were just collecting emails for our email address list, but really, it's so much more than that. And so I think getting them to buy into that is really important.
Thank you. Well, I know we're at time for 2:15, but I can see we've still got a lot of questions. If you would like to come out and approach any of our speakers after the session, please feel welcome to. And if I can put a quick plug in for the MCN Data and Insights Special Interest Group, if anybody would like to join that, or working groups in DC, New York, San Francisco, or London, do let me know after the session. I'll put you in touch with those details. Thank you very much for coming along today.